just in case people are tuning in. So now we're live. Some of you are still not kind of connecting these things together across modules. The whole purpose of doing this and rewriting the class the way that I did, I took out a lot of the conceptual material that, quite frankly, was baffling to students, talking about, media effects and talking about agenda setting and all that. I'm going to have to find a way to put that back in because I still think it's important. And I'm not sure how much of it is being taught, across campus in communications either. That's not an indictment. I just literally don't know. Okay, but what I wanted to do was to create a narrative that would allow you to enter into that narrative and make sense of things that have evolved over time. The objective of the narrative being everything that you think is new isn't. Okay, that these are all things that we've seen before. And it doesn't mean that there are not peculiarities to them. Yes, Twitter is different from, the Telegraph, but in terms of innovations in technology driving transformations in social interaction, that's as old as the Republic. Okay, and it's certainly at least 150, 170 years old. Right? That's the main thing. So I want you to be able to think about that and have it make sense. Otherwise, this material will not stick in your heads and you will get no value out of the class. Right? So one of the things I'd like to see you do, okay, is especially on this last module, you've had several weeks now to kind of connect all this stuff together and think about it more holistically. If you, to the extent that you can refer back to the materials in previous modules, I'm going to really emphasize that in terms of how I evaluate your work. Now, I'm not going to say it's required because I told you at the beginning of the term that there was no, comprehensive assignment or final or anything like that. But it's a good thing to be able to do. It shows that rather than just remembering things short term, you're actually learning them. I had an interesting conversation with one of your colleagues who is a super brilliant student. But she'd been through the methods class and we had covered simple statistical analysis that would up to certain kinds of inferential statistics that you would use in research. She's doing this really interesting research. I'm not going to explain it because I don't want it to be a giveaway. She remembered nothing from that class. And it was because it's numbers and the numbers just bounced off and all that. Well, if you'll notice, I didn't put any numbers in here. Okay, so there's nothing really for you to bounce off of. Most of the material is a pretty straightforward narrative. Now, one of the first piece we're going to cover today on journalistic political communication is very technical. There's a lot of technical jargon in it, and I understand that. We'll go through and kind of decode that a little bit. But I've really tried to avoid that as much as I can and instead go for sort of more straightforward historical narrative, okay? So again, purpose of the assignments, I want you to be able to tell me, start with, okay, here's what the author wants us to learn. And that's usually going to be one thing. Here's what the author wants us to learn. If there's more than one author, here's what the authors would like us to learn. Then you can walk me through, okay, how do they go about doing that? There's this, like with this first article we're going to do, there's a specific way to do that. The article is broken down conceptually, and there are sections of the paper, each of which deals with a section. Rather than just painstakingly summarize that, because we're all supposed to have read it, explain to me how that relates to what the author's trying to teach us, okay? The idea of, what am I supposed, always be asking yourself, what am I supposed to learn from this, okay? So these particular authors are talking about the challenge of trying to evaluate, systematically and empirically, whether or not or how journalistic political coverage has or has not softened, okay? So who wants to start on that? We got two people supposed to do it today.
I can start for us.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so the author wants us to learn about 4, but really 5 of the most prominent concepts related to how journalism has been softening over the last decades, really. And the most prominent concepts that he wants to take away are sensationalism, hard and soft news, infotainment, tabloidization, and then the 5th one is eroding boundaries of journalism. And these are all buzzwords that I'm sure we've heard before,
Okay,
but
they're not buzzwords. Buzzwords are vernacular. These are not buzzwords. These are methodological concepts. We're
Okay,
not
well
allowed
then,
to use buzzwords in our work.
okay, sorry. Well, then they're concepts that we've probably heard about before. But I was surprised that it started the article off with a quote from Carl Bernstein in 1992 saying, for more than 15 years, we have been moving away from real journalism towards the creation of sleazoid infotainment, which I just thought was interesting setting up the article.
Why
And
do you
then,
think that? Why do you, hold on? Why do you think that's interesting, given
well,
what the
just
authors are trying to teach us?
because personally I had thought it was more so the last decade to 2 decades where it's been a softening of journalism, and then here we're seeing that it's been going back a lot longer than that.
Yeah, of course. Okay, good. Do you want to put pause on it right there for a second? And Liam, did you want to slide in there, follow up on that?
Sure. Yeah. And so, yeah, kind of following up on that, the whole issue of this article, softening of journalist of political journalism, has been studied at least since the 60s, though interest in that, as was detailed in the article, has definitely not waned over time with, as the article said, 20. Hi, dog. I'm in class. Go away. Sorry, my dog is bothering me.
One of the many reasons I don't have pets, as much as I like dogs.
With 20% of publications that the authors, I guess, found having been published since 2010. Wow, you are just messing around. Anyways, what else?
Okay, let's do this.
Sorry.
Can I hop back in?
Let me cross-examine. Okay.
Can I hop back in for a minute?
No, you can't, because I'm the boss. Or as I used to say when I was a little kid, apparently I am the boss of myself. No, I think this might be easier because we're pressed for time. Carson, you mentioned several elements of what are generally described as the softening of political journalism, right?
Yeah, I was just going to talk about those unless you want to.
Okay, I don't want you to talk about them. Okay, what I'd like you to do is sort of like that, as economically as possible. Tell me what each of them is, first of all. Tell me what each of them actually is. Let's get that first, because for those of you who haven't read this yet, I understand. I mean, Carson referred to them as buzzwords. I know what you mean, but they are technical terms. And if you're not trained in that discipline or something like my discipline relevant to that, right, then it's not going to make any sense. But walk us through each of those terms insofar as you can. I mean, in a sentence, tell us this is what they're talking about, and this is why we need to know it.
All right, so sensationalization. Okay, well, I'm blanking the word now.
Sensationalization.
Yeah, it's the idea that you want to evoke emotion and evoke a emotional response from someone while they're watching the news immediately. So that could be whether you're trying to provoke them towards empathy, hate, love, whatever it is. You want them to come back to it because they're emotionally connected to it.
Okay, why would you want to do that instead of just telling people what happened?
Well, because our new. Go ahead, Liam.
So within the article, they set out a proposed framework that was the kind of the meat of the article, and then applying these different concepts within it and how they fall within that. And sensationalism and sensationalization, that's a mouthful, fell within the lowest rung of that, how that needs and needed the lowest amount of journalistic investigation, because it is just evoking those emotions, and emotions are what people connect to, what they come back to, and as like writers and whatnot, like primarily in fiction, because that's what I deal with. We are trying to make that connection so that people engage and whatnot, and
try to avoid and whatnot. Okay, because it's confusing. Now, do you say people won't engage or will engage?
Will engage, because.
And why is that important?
Engagement is how all of these services make money. And
Is that what the article says?
no, that's connecting it to.
No, I mean, but it's important that we first start there. I'm not saying you're wrong, but you know, the reason why I ask is, is there ever any explanation in this professional article of why these changes might have taken place? Not what the changes were, but why they took place.
Not necessarily related to sensationalization. Can't pronounce that right now, but going over the broader aspect that fits into, which is like how this system is framed. It does go into at the end how these huge companies do have a bottom line.
In journalism, there's a name for that. There's another buzzword for that, or buzz phrase for that. It's called burying the lead. Okay. In other words, in some ways, what is most important about this is one of the things mentioned latest in the discussion, which is why were these changes? Now, I understand the focus here is, well, this is how things changed. If you look on page 140, there's a figure there with these 5 levels of analysis, these 5 conceptual approaches to, the softening of journalistic communication. So for those of you who haven't read the article yet, go to page 140 first, okay? Because the nice thing about that, and this is what Liam was doing before I very crudely interrupted him, because, I wanted to make sure that his observation was emphasized, that there is a fiscal reason for this. But that to save us some time, that little figure there will explain roughly what each of these concepts is and how it works. Then you can go skim through the article, get a little more detail on what each of these concepts is. But let me kind of press on here. These are different levels of analysis, and this is very technical stuff. But for either of you, either Carson or Liam, you can decide who wants to take this. If we take the findings of this article on balance in terms of here are the things you need to learn, I'm going to ask you one more time, not because you haven't answered it, but so that we're clear. What are the conclusions here? What should we walk away with and think, okay, I didn't know that before, or I didn't understand how that worked before. Now I think I do.
I would say that the conclusion you should walk away with is that journalists are less so relying on their own investigation and reporting of the facts and news, and more so relying on the government to tell them what the story is. And then
that's always been the case. That's always been the case.
Well, okay, then I don't know what the takeaway is.
Well, no, I mean, that's always been, I mean, how else are we going to find out what's going on in the White House unless we get somebody who works in the White House to tell us?
Yeah, but I just mean that it's more so like we just listen to the press secretary now, and there's no more investigating like that.
Well, we know that that's not true. I mean, investigative reporting is a lot. The New York Times is doing investigative reporting all the time. Washington Post is investigating all the time. But you're going in the right direction, though. Okay. There's a sense of a loss of the independence of journalists here, on the one hand. But the problem is, and tell me either Liam or Carson if you disagree, I don't see that explained explicitly here. That somehow what Carson's describing is an increasing dependence of the mainstream media on the very institutions and individuals on whom they're supposed to be reporting objectively.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I am both reading my notes and scanning back over. And at least from my understanding of the article, it definitely is implying, and the reader can infer that conclusion, but I don't think it ever is explicitly said.
Well, that's 2 points. One that Carson's brought up, one that you brought up. Liam, you initially brought up the idea of the sort of bottom line element of this. Look, we need eyeballs on screens. We got it. Now what's changed isn't explained there. Now what's changed is the business model of journalism. That's changed significantly. When Carl Bernstein was talking about that in that, whatever that was, 1993 or whenever he was talking about that, right? He was responding to something that was about 10 to 12 years old. And it was a decision within the major television networks, because this was when broadcast networks were still dominating everything, right? The 80s. Cable wasn't really doing much of anything. And the idea was, you're going to have to start turning a profit now. the CBS News division had always been this really high prestige, very serious news organization. People took it very seriously. It was a source of record. It was the New York Times of television. It wasn't just junk. It was supposed to be good, solid journalism. And, there was an element of investigation to television journalism. This was especially apparent during Vietnam. So part of what Carson is saying is not that there used to be lots of investigation and now there isn't any. But the point, Carson, that you're making that's important is when you're investigating, you are initiating the action. Remember when we were talking about yellow journalism and journalistic activism and all that? Does that make sense? Remember that? And the idea that, hey, we're going to go down there and we're going to find out where the story is. Carson, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you seem to be saying in an interesting way is that old ethic of the journalist going out and beating the bushes for news and finding out where it is isn't as strong as it was even at the time of the Spanish-American War. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would just think that the article, it might not straight out come out and say it, but I think it implies that. And maybe more so beyond that, I think I could be wrong when I say government. It actually more so is the audience dictating what the news is producing now, because I don't know, it's just the government and news work together to feed the audience what they want to hear.
Well, that's always been the case. But the difference was, and I think it's almost impossible for us to say with any confidence that the audience is actually dictating the content. Okay. What's happening is something close to that. And this is what the authors are trying to get at with this notion of what's called infotainment. That the idea is if we're going to be profitable, we need to follow the business model of those elements of television in particular that are profitable. What are they? They're entertainment. Okay. They engage the viewer and listener emotionally. Okay. Because if we don't do that, they're not going to stay engaged. So what that means is we got to give them things that are easily digestible. The definition of tabloid, one of the things I like they did in there is they give you the origin of the concept of tabloid. It was an easy to swallow pill. Okay. So the early notion of tabloid journalism was this is easy for you to understand. There's nothing very complicated here. The problem is with all of this political stuff, it's incredibly complicated. So there's an oversimplification of content. What Carson, I think you mean to say, and tell me if I'm wrong, is there's more of a sense that media are pandering to an audience who they think is dumb and inattentive. They're not
exactly
right, which is you're right. I mean that there certainly that is going on because the business model has changed fundamentally. Brett, do you have your hand up or are you just stretching?
I had my hand up.
Okay, go ahead.
Because that's one of the things that I kept coming back to in this article was something you said last week, just about lack of ability of incoming students to read academic work, and that started kicking around in my head that it's kind of the same thing with journalism. Why spend the effort and the time to write a really excellent piece that's kind of complicated and pulls lots of concepts together when you know that the general reader doesn't have the attention span or the interest to try to understand what you're writing. So it's partially like what you were saying. You can't write stuff that won't get read.
It's more so the case with broadcasting than it is with long form journalism and newspapers and magazines. And that's because there's a different public that reads a newspaper. Of course, nobody reads a newspaper anymore, but you know what I mean. In other words, those who largely consumed their news by reading it, and that's a dying generation. You were writing for them. They wanted, they were people like me who I don't care about anybody's opinion, but I really need to know as much as you can tell me about what the hell is going on in Myanmar right now. What's going on, on the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia right now. I need to know those things. I don't need to know how people feel. I don't need to know what the reporter's feeling. I don't need graphic imagery. I need to know what's going on. But I'm a weird, customer in that sense, in that I do it professionally. But for the general audience, what holds true is what Brett suggested and what Carson suggested and what Liam implied. It's like, these are people who don't normally care much about politics, don't know much about politics, but we still kind of have this civic obligation to say, hey, today in Washington, this is what happened. So we got to find interesting, and I think both Liam and Carson said this, engaging ways to draw the viewer in, hold the viewer's attention, right? Now, again, if I'm having trouble teaching this stuff, where you volunteered, you pay to come in here, and I'm still having trouble keeping your attention. Imagine, a news network where you at the push of a button, they are out of your life forever. Okay, that's the challenge. And I would suggest that's not really made sufficiently explicit here. All these techniques exist because of this struggle with the emergence of cable news, of the 24-hour news cycle, and this constant push to create content. It isn't even anymore about news, it's just content, anything. That's why commentary has taken over from hard news, because it doesn't require anything but somebody with a gift of gab and a staff to keep them moderately well informed. Rush Limbaugh didn't know anything. Sean Hannity doesn't know anything. A lot of these commentators don't really know very much, but they all have a way of engaging an audience and telling a story and inflaming the passions and things like that, right? That sort of tabloidization of it, right? Engaging emotionally with the audience and with the content, connecting people emotionally. That's important, because normally the model for journalism was that the coverage should be objective and dispassionate. All right. Your business was to, if you were going to rile people up, it was going to be because you told them what they needed to know. Now it's like, no, I just need to pull certain strings emotionally, and that individual will sit up and listen. Okay, that's changed. Okay, that's pretty good. Let me, if I can though, go through some, maybe using slightly different and more familiar terms. This is what they're talking about with tabloidization and softening, okay? One of the things that's mentioned there, but again, I think insufficiently, is the use of popular slang or vernacular and even obscenity, what used to be considered obscenity. Journalists now are what are called journalists, commentators, whatever, can say things now that used not to be allowed by the FCC. And they do this in broadcasts that used to be and still are called the news. So, for example, I just heard 3 times today, people talking about the Director of National Intelligence and the FBI and a bunch of other people putting out these kinds of warnings of, well, there might be something going on, with respect to either today or tomorrow, maybe another assault on the Capitol, whatever. And in the space of about 5 minutes, I heard those people who were, judging by internet chatter, contemplating this, described as crazy. Okay, that's not journalism. It's not professional. It's not journalism. And in fact, it's kind of bigoted, especially with all the focus on mental health and this nominal empathy and concern about mental health right now. For someone calling themselves a professional journalist, and one journalist did this, a guy who calls himself a journalist, did this twice in successive sentences, referred to these people as crazy. Not as angry, not as frustrated, not as misinformed or anything else, but as crazy. Okay, that's softening of journalism. The word crazy is a lightning rod term. It's going to engage people, but also you're declaring a side when you do that. You are explicitly subjective. Okay. And that's another part of this new thing is, instead of even aspiring to objectivity, you are explicitly subjective. You are actually telling the listener or the viewer how you feel. Okay. That isn't news. Okay. So it's the commentator, or in quotes, reporter's point of view. And increasingly, it's not even just their vantage point, it's what they're feeling about something that is increasingly becoming the story. I can't tell you how frustrating it is for somebody who does what I do for a living to kick on the news at 5 a.m. and have people telling me how they feel, or emoting vocally, or rolling their eyes, or doing whatever. So I can't watch news. I can't watch news anymore. I have to listen to it through Sirius and just get the audio feed. I can't stand to watch these people perform because it's disgusting to me. It's like, look, don't play emotional games with me. I don't have any. I just need to know what's going on. This is part of what the authors are talking about that both Carson and Liam talked about. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So I haven't done a whole lot of research on this, and you may be more well-informed in this, but so how do I phrase this? So within like politics and globally growing polarization and whatnot, how much of the news then feeding into that, then feeding, being an echo chamber reverberation, do you think? I mean, it has an effect, but gosh, I think I'm phrasing this wrong.
How much does it contribute to that?
Yeah, kind
Completely.
of.
Absolutely, completely.
And then they just play back into each other,
Yeah,
and
of course.
it just piles on.
Yeah, and one of the things, if you look on the Moodle page, one of the things I mentioned is this notion of new media as niche media. Increasingly, there's a certain kind of viewer, right, who just watches MSNBC, or who just watches CNN, or who just watches Fox, or who just watches, One American News or something like that, right? Those are little niches, and you don't get a lot of, cross-cutting beliefs and perspectives and views, either among the people who are generally creating the content or the people who are observing and responding to it. There's no question at all empirically that the evidence of increasing polarization such as it exists coincides with the emergence of the 24-hour news cycle and the Fox News journalistic business model. There's no question of that at all. And so everything has just become more and more sort of niched and again, explicitly subjective. The other side is wrong is not journalism. It's not even very good commentary, but it's not journalism. So yeah, it's been an overwhelming impact. Okay, because it frames the news for you. Okay, the notion of a framing effect used to just mean, well, this isn't really intended. This is just kind of something that happens because of the way news is covered. Framing now is much more explicit than it ever was. Well, you'd have to go back to the mid-19th century and explicitly partisan newspapers to find where it was more obvious that something was framed for a certain specific audience. So I'm hoping that's what you're asking. I'm hoping I'm answering your question. It is very much a part of the perception of polarization because it's all the news media talk about.
Yeah,
and then in a way,
that answers
just by hammering away at it continuously, they kind of make it happen. We're not nearly as polarized as we're presented as being, but it's getting to the point with me now where, in social science terms, I'm pissing in the wind because everyone is so convinced, first of all, that all of this stuff is new and we've never seen it before, and that the other side is wrong, and that we're hopelessly polarized. Everyone seems to believe that. Every time I'm dragged out, for some public event or something like that, and I caution people and I cite all the data against that and the polling data and everything else, people just, you can see, they just shut me off. They don't want to hear it. That's a consequence of the way people consume that version of the world that's presented by their media. And that's a great question. It's a great question. The other part of that, so we've got, again, the use, the sort of dumbing down of language, and that's really what it is. And one of the things you'll notice, if you watch MSNBC, there's a commentator by the name of Ari Melber. Now, Ari Melber is a lawyer and a very smart guy, but he insists on, he's trying to sound cool, right? So he insists on using hip hop references, Now, get over yourself. You're not 12 anymore. You're supposed to be a professional, and you have the intellectual capacity to explain things to me. I don't need hip hop references, which I find tedious and silly, okay, when I'm looking for news, okay? But he does it all the time. It's because he's making himself part of the story. Hey, look at me performing for you. Look how hip I am. Look how, even though he isn't, he sounds totally dorky, but look how cool I am. I can drop these inside references, and aren't I just the coolest, guy in the world? Well, that's relatively new. Okay. That what used to be journalism has now become this weird kind of performance art. And it really has. Okay. So you've got that popular slang vernacular. You've got explicit subjectivity. You've got personalization. This is mentioned in the article. where, instead of talking about policies, we talk about politicians. Okay. Instead of dealing with issues, we deal with individuals. Either, these are the crazies who might come to the Capitol. Never mind what their grievances might be. You don't have to agree with those grievances in order to understand that they're there, and that helps you understand why people would do that. People don't do what happened on January 6th because they're evil. They do it because they're angry. Now, they might be angry because they've been fed a line of bullshit in social science terms, okay, and they were foolish enough to believe it. Okay, that's true, but that doesn't make them evil. But and also doesn't make them crazy. And with all the sensitivity now about mental health, you think the last thing that the progressives at MSNBC or CNN would do is toss out cavalierly that word crazy. But I heard Rachel Maddow do it last night. I heard two reporters do it again within the space of about 3 minutes today. And I felt like putting my foot up somebody's theoretical ass. Because it's like, how am I going to teach my students when you're telling them to look at this big section of the country, granted it's a minority, but it's a vocal minority, and dismiss their grievances as being just the stuff of being crazy? That's not only bad journalism, that ought to get people fired. Instead, it's getting people book deals. I heard two separate commentators in the same segment on MSNBC reference their own books. These are regular MSNBC contributors. Where's my hammer? And how do I get to your house? Because I need news. You want anger? I will give it to you. So what Liam and Carson are doing is they're trying to give you an idea of, here's the way this article conceptualizes this. And I think you did a good job. What I need you to think about is why? Why are people doing this? Because there's gold in them thar hills. If you can use hip hop references and, sympathize with one movement while demonizing another movement is crazy, whether you're on Fox News or MSNBC or whatever it is, you're going to get viewers, you're going to get big contracts, you're going to make money. It's like an athlete getting shoe deals. You're going to get a lot of stuff. There's money to be made. And if what you're doing is being a professional bullshitter, great. You know why? Because it's an easy gig. Just making stuff up is easy. You know how I know? Because I used to do radio. We used to make fun of that. We had a fake talk show that we did. I wasn't in college, but my buddies were in college at a college radio station where I lived. And I would go in there and we'd do this fake commentary. And I played two different characters. One of them was this absolute fire-breathing socialist, Marxist. And another one was this sort of right-wing guy, prefiguring Rush Limbaugh. It was based on an old school guy by the name of Joe Pine, who was a libertarian my dad used to listen to. All right. I could sit there and just freestyle that stuff because it's easy. You don't have to know anything. But if you're a journalist, there's a lot you have to know. Okay. Now, what some of you wouldn't pick up from this, because the primary focus here is television. If you're a reporter for the New York Times, you got to know your stuff. You got to be a journalist. You can't pull this stuff off on the front page of the New York Times. You'll get fired. And that's fine. That's great. Or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, whatever. They're still journalists and they still do that work. They do the heavy lifting now. The people on TV look decorative, appeal to you emotionally. Okay. So you get, for example, in May of 2017, okay, Anderson Cooper, right? Mr. Professional, I think not, was interviewing one of Trump's surrogates who was trying to kind of justify something that Trump was doing and explain it, something about Comey and all that. And Anderson Cooper actually said, this was as close to my jaw dropping as I'm going to get. He said, on live television, Donald Trump could take a dump on his desk and you would defend that. And I'm like, wait a minute, whoa, did I just hear that? What a punk. What a punk. And it was so bad that he had to apologize, I think, at the end of that show. And then he made it official because he apologized on Twitter. Okay, that's not journalism. And that's not news. That's Anderson Cooper feeling. like I care. And that's the final thing with this notion of this new subjectivity and stuff, is the emphasis is on feelings instead of meaning or consequences. It's just on feelings. Here's how you should feel. Okay. Any questions about that? That was a good presentation. Started out a little slow, but I think it generally, I think was quite good. Questions, comments, disagreements?
There is a comment in the chat.
Oh, I know, but I have that
No, I know.
down because, okay, let's see. Is this Dylan? Is there any concern that we could become a more polarized society if people continue to buy into the idea that I think we covered that one. Yes, we are. There's not concern. It's happening and it's poison. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's not even, I mean, notice a lot of times I'll answer a question in kind of an equivocal way. Well, depending on how the data shake out. I've looked at the data. There's no question. The most polarized people are the heaviest consumers of polarized news. No, there's no question of that. Okay. So the answer to that would be yes, absolutely. And that, which is one of the reasons why I put that article in there, to give us something. I got to find a better one, but I wanted to actually have some sort of communications theory in here, so you could say, well, this is how the media people do it. This is how they go about the business of doing it. All right. What about the, speaking of, explicitly subjective, references to news and everything. What about the Epoch Times? What's the deal with the Epoch Times? Either Monica or Andrea.
I can start.
Okay.
So I kind of got like two really big takeaways from the Epoch Times. And the first one being that media and politics are very intertwined. And the second one being that there's a lot of red tapes that the reporters actually have to go through. And also they kind of just roll with what they're fed. And that's kind of just what they have to say. So the Epoch Times.
Let's take this in small bites.
Yeah.
Because we're Americans and we're not very bright.
Yeah.
When you say there's a lot of red tape, what do you mean? They're not bureaucrats.
Yeah, kind of what I mean by that. Maybe red tape wasn't the right phrase, but they have to say certain things, and they also have to have a certain leaning when they're reporting. And they're kind of fed they can't, for example, in the Epoch Times, they were told that they can't talk about anything relating to homosexuality. So they have certain guidelines and limitations.
Okay, so that's what you meant was guidelines.
Yeah, guidelines.
Yeah, really specific kind of bullet point guidelines.
Yeah, so there's certain things that they can't talk about. And also, just kind of from the article, it seemed like they weren't treated the best. They were kind of working long hours every day and kind of being pushed to their limits.
Oh, you mean like journalists?
Yeah, yeah.
Journalism's a shit job.
Yeah.
It really is. You get treated lousy. Everyone hates you. No one wants you to be there, and no one appreciates what you do. So in that sense, that's as close to being journalists as a lot of those people are.
Yeah, definitely. But the thing I noticed.
What is Epoch Times?
Yeah, so Epoch Times is a right-wing New York news-based outlet. And they kind of strayed from the norm for typical news outlets. And
I would say that.
Yeah, definitely strayed from the norm, because the media's outlet and ownership was closely tied to Falun Gong. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah, but they were a Chinese spiritual community with the stated goal of taking down China's government. So that was kind of their main thing. And they both kind of had some similarities because they both kind of had an anti-communist stance. And Falun Gong really appreciated the pro-Trump stance just because they knew that Trump was a good anti-communist ally for them. So that was kind of a big thing.
Well, they thought he was.
Yeah, that was their whole impression of him. Yeah. So they really approved of that.
Okay, leave something for your partner.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of mention one more thing. I'll put it to Monica because I don't want to take too much time.
But that's good. First of all, before we fire you up on this, you mentioned a lot of things there, Andrea. Are there questions on any of that or need for clarification? Or Monica, did you want to some of those things could stand some clarification. You gave us the kind of flyover of it. In other words, if the first article we looked at is emphasizing the importance of getting readers or getting viewers, why create something like Epoch Times? If it is, as Andrea suggested, if it's sort of way out there in terms of being very different from normal journalism or being explicitly ideological and everything, why niche yourself like that when most of the country isn't like that? It doesn't seem like a very smart business move. Monica?
For your personal agenda. Like they wanted very much to get these ideologies, this anti-communist sort of agenda out there, and to make sure that people in America and I believe it was China, China, were fiercely anti-communist, not just like not participating in communism, but actively participating in anti-communism. And they thought that
that's an important distinction. Good.
Participating in the American media and American politics would help that globally, since America has a lot of global media power.
So would you say then, would you describe Epoch Times, thinking like a social scientist now, would you consider that, rather than being journalism, would you consider that to be propaganda? Doesn't have to be false to be propaganda.
Personally, I think that that's a more accurate assessment, especially given just this article's description of Epoch Times. It seemed to be more that they were trying to, at least from my perspective, the style of the article seemed more like they were trying to expose a cult rather than shed light on a different journalistic style. And so I think that's my reasoning why it would be more considered propaganda versus just regular biased journalism.
Are we, building on the last remark you just made is interesting. Have we become kind of acclimatized to explicitly biased journalism now? Do we know bias when we encounter it? Do we know when we're being fed a line of, like MSNBC now, or even CNN is pretty, I think it's not beyond consideration to think that a lot of their talking points are essentially the talking points of the mainstream of the Democratic Party, the Joe Biden wing of the Democratic Party. Okay. One thing I will say though, okay, I don't know how many of you have been following this, but this has to do with the distinction between something like Epoch Times and a news outlet, to the extent that it is, like CNN or MSNBC. There's been a pretty volatile controversy underway right now with respect to the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo. Okay. He's had now 3 allegations of sexual misconduct or sexual harassment. Okay. And it looks pretty much like there's a lot of fire where that smoke is. Okay. One of the things that has struck me about that, okay, because what I'll do sometimes is jump between the outlets. I was really surprised at how little Fox was talking about it, since it is a Democrat, and a Democrat who was being considered as a possible presidential candidate in 2024. But CNN and MSNBC won't get off of it. And that's supposed to be their guy. That would suggest that what they're trying to be is journalists, that they're trying not to be explicitly biased, at least with respect to party, right? But during the Trump administration, when there would be allegations brought by a James Comey or something like that, and there would be against Republicans, or with all the recent corruption scandals that have emerged and still are emerging, with respect to, the former transportation secretary and any number of people in the Trump cabinet. Fox never talks about that stuff, almost never, partly because the bulk of Fox programming is commentary, and that's all sort of on one side of things. Is that something we should be aware of, or am I making too much of that, do you think? Yeah, Monica?
Just to clarify, you're asking if we notice that there's bias in these things, or if that's something that just
in other
goes
words,
under the radar?
would you bias? What I just described to you sounds like, on the one hand, an attempt to be more or less even-handed with respect to partisanship. On the other hand, with Fox, pretty explicit pro-Republican bias. Are people aware of that?
I think people are aware of the bias, but it's not, I think the interpretation of the bias is different than it would be if you're used to completely objective journalism. Like the way I see it, it seems more like the news is less trying to say a statement of fact regarding current events and more trying to participate in their side of an ongoing debate. And so if you're on that side, it seems more like fact to you, even though it has a spin on it. So I would say that it's a little of both, that it's just a different perspective of what people consider news.
Is it that we recognize the bias and we're just aware of it, or do we not care? I mean, if you're watching nothing but Fox, like my father watches nothing but Fox. Okay. He believes or acts as though he believes everything that he sees and hears on Fox. Okay. I obviously have given up trying to talk politics with him, especially media and politics, because he's my dad, you know, what the hell? I'm going to plague the old man. I don't think he's aware. And he's a very smart guy. Now, he's lost a lot off his fastball. He's 96, but he's a very smart guy. I don't think he's aware that a lot of what he's being given is tantamount to propaganda. It's a constant campaign. Remember that campaigns are exercises in propaganda. That's exactly what they are. And propaganda doesn't have to be false. Brett, did you have your hand up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I mean, especially in relation to like televised broadcast news outlets, I just, because of the advent of and when television happened in American history, you don't have that same transparency that you do in the early days of newspapers. I mean, the paper in Albany is still the Democrat Herald. Pretty easy to figure out where the roots of that newspaper were from a political standpoint, you know. And the early days of journalism, you could, I mean, they named themselves those, like they called it was a Democrat newspaper, and you knew that.
Some of it, yeah.
I think, especially reporting on political news in the country that you live in, it's impossible to not be biased, and because it's not impossible to not be biased, but especially filling a 24-hour news cycle, it's very difficult to remove personal opinion from politics that affects your own life.
You mean difficult for whom?
It seems to be most of the talking heads on television.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay.
And here's why. Okay. There were any number of people reporting the news in the 1960s who had very specific political views. Remember, these are often the most attentive people in the country. They cover politics for a living. But what a lot of people would not have realized is what a lot of the personal political views of those people were. They because it was considered so unprofessional to exert an opinion, editors would step all over you. Okay, so it's not, in fact, it's actually hard for a professional journalist to inject opinion because so much of that is trained out of you. Here's the problem, Brett. The people you're watching, the little talking hairdos, most of them are not trained journalists. They're entertainers, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, CNN and Fox and the 24-hour news cycle is a fairly recent invention. Obviously, news was always happening 24 hours, but the ability to consume
circa 1990, yeah, sure, it's fairly new.
How am I trying to phrase this? I just don't think that there has been the same transparency from the outlets. It's something that consumers of this kind of media need to suss out on their own, and the people cashing the checks are happy to let them do that or not do that, you know, depending on their financial motivation.
Well, okay, then if we move from that, if we move from what are at least nominally supposed to be professional news organizations, you know, Fox or MSNBC or CNN, I'm leaving out the newspapers because they still are pretty professional and pretty objective by American standards anyway. When we get to something like Epoch Times, how then are we supposed to make sense of what they're doing? Should we prevent it? Or should that be protected by the First Amendment guarantee of a free press, first of all?
I mean, I think so. I mean, there's been some pretty wild examples of speech protected by the First Amendment throughout the course of American history.
Yeah, there have. That's right. And one of the organizations, by the way, that would agree with you is the American Civil Liberties Union, which is normally and mistakenly considered to be a left-wing organization. It's not. There's nothing left-wing about civil liberties. That's a libertarian notion. Okay. So I think generally speaking, people tend to be really uncomfortable in this country still, but I would say maybe less so. There are a lot of people now who want to see the other side censored. They want to see the other side closed down. And one of the targets of that for a while, although they seem to have kind of burst their bubble, was Epic Times. They aren't as relevant as they were even a year ago, because they've been replaced by, One American News and things like that. Plus, you still have to more or less read a lot of what Epic Times is doing. Yeah, Andrea.
I just wanted to add something that I found interesting when reading the article. In the article, it said that actually before 2016, the Epic Times didn't really have a strong political stance. This developed kind of when the Trump era started, and I think a lot of it is because they wanted to experiment and see, hey, would I get more sales and revenue if we started to develop this stance and if we became pro-Trump? And I think a lot of it was just kind of an experiment, because I remember even reading the article and they mentioned something. They were like, oh, now the experiment is over. So it just seems to me that this was just kind of a test to see what would happen if they did kind of develop this strong political stance.
Well, to some extent, the same thing happened with Fox News. When Fox News premiered, I think I mentioned this already in class, but they were actually allowing airtime to a lot of people who had pretty polarized political views. One of the most notable among them was Noam Chomsky. Now, you never see Noam Chomsky on network news. You never see him on, MSNBC or CNN. Even now, you never see him. I don't think he's nearly as important as a lot of people think, but the left in the country was kind of carrying his water, or he theirs, for decades. The first time I saw him on television was Fox News. So when they first started out, they were, as you say, they were experimenting. Well, what's the way to do this? What they found very quickly was that the best way for that network to work was to follow the business model of talk radio. Pretty much all commentary all the time. And so the coverage of news became less. We're seeing the same thing happen with MSNBC and CNN. The networks still pretty much do news. They, if it can be done, they do it. It's not very interesting, but they still do it. Anything else on Epic Times? Anything else that, or things like that? Yeah, Monica.
Just to add on to what Andrea said with this experiment, that just to see what they could do. In the article, it does say that it was successful for them, both in terms of their increased revenue and their increased eyes on the page. They got more engagement from the public and kind of put their name out there. And I think much of that just, and this is all anecdotal, I'm not referencing anything here, but it seems like a lot of the polarized news stations that we see today saw an increase in their views, or at least shareability, when they participated in this overly biased journalism technique.
Yeah, it's a good point, and one of the things we noticed is that when you tie in like that, again, that explicit subjectivity, no, this is our view, okay. And to me, it's like, if you're explicit, gets to Brett's point. If you're transparent, if you're honest about your subjectivity and say, look, this is our point of view. I think of a publication like the National Review was founded by William F. Buckley back, around 1960. The National Review has been explicitly conservative to neoconservative, pro-libertarian, anti-communist, all the way through, right? From its inception. Everyone knows that. Magazine called The Nation, which is considerably older, has been pretty much pro-civil liberties and center left for about the same amount of time. I used to read both of those when I was a student all the way through graduate school. And what I found was that I knew what I was getting from both sides. I also knew I was getting super brilliant people from both sides. So I was going to hear the best arguments that both sides had. That's valuable. So to the extent that somebody like Epoch Times comes along and says, hey, look, we're anti-communist and, you know, whatever, even more than pro-Trump, we're anti-communist. Sure, let me hear what your argument is. Let me hear current history. There's a quasi-scholarly publication called Current History. It's explicitly neoconservative and anti-communist. Okay, some of their scholarship is a little shoddy, but a lot of it is really good. Okay, and I used to read that. It got a little too ideological and a little too faulty in its scholarship. But this is that transparency issue is the issue. You know, tell us that they're, you know, we're only giving you one side of this. I think then you're actually, that's a useful thing to do. Yeah, Brett, did you have your hand up again?
Yeah, that's just more succinctly the point that I think I was trying to make, is like, have whatever bias you want, just let everybody know. Because then you can approach it from a fairly critical standpoint, and you can pull out, you know, because there's got to be something, there's something there. You know, there has to be something to have an opinion about. So if you're honest about where you're coming from, it's a lot more useful to the consumer of that information.
Well, there's also more to be learned, because you can say, okay, I used to know. It's like, okay, the people who are working for Ronald Reagan, I recognized a lot of those names from conservative publications, scholars, you know, the Heritage, American Enterprise, the National Review. It's like, hey, I know these guys. Okay, in other words, I would never have referred to most of them as crazy, right? One of the things that puzzled a lot of people when Trump came into power was, who are these people? Who is this Stephen Miller guy? You know, he's been one of the most enigmatic figures I've seen in you know, working in a White House, because he doesn't seem to know anything. Okay, and he's a strident ideologue and an absolute enemy of truth. Okay, that's unusual. You didn't see people like that in the George W. Bush administration. You saw people who were explicit in their views, you know, Paul Wolfowitz, people like that, Rumsfeld. This is their view of the world. And you could engage on that level. Okay. The differences were largely differences of policy, as opposed to, well, one of them is a fantasist and the other one is trying to tell the truth. So part of the problem with this, and this gets us into QAnon, is, what if it's not just about what Brett's talking about and what both Andrea and Monica mentioned? What if it's not about kind of an experiment in discourse? Well, let's try this, you know, but people will know what our views are. They may not know about Falun Gong and all that kind of stuff, but they'll know. It's like, yeah, this is a right-wing publication. It's pretty straightforward. It's a generally pro-Christian publication. It's conservative and culturally as well as politically. What about something like QAnon, though, where it's like, a lot of that stuff is just hallucinatory? It really is. Yeah, Monica.
Before getting into the QAnon stuff, I just wanted to see, the way I was thinking about it within the article, it seems less like the Epoch Times set out to be a conservative, to facilitate a conservative narrative, and more latched on to the conservative narrative because it fit more in with their original ideas.
I think it depends on two things at least. One is there were people working for Epoch Times who wanted to be journalists, and they got hired there. It was like, okay, it's an opportunity. I mean, we all took those gigs. We were what were called stringers, and we would take a gig with anybody who would hire us, unless they had a really repellent editorial policy. Initially, the Epoch Times didn't really have an explicit editorial policy. When they started imposing that, it became clear to a lot of people, this is a programmatic operation. This isn't journalism. This is something else. So the reason why I put that there is because it doesn't fit the normal models. It doesn't even fit in with the sort of softening of journalistic political communication model that we talked about earlier. It's not Fox News either. It's something else. Now it's a model that may not very well not last much longer. And there are reasons why that it just won't be monetizable, but we'll come back to that a little bit. Were there any other questions before we go into QAnon? Any other questions or comments on Epoch Times? Yeah.
I might be overinflating this aspect of the article, but I thought it was interesting, at least in the context of the previous article, let me see, what was the name of that one? The Softening of Journalism.
Yeah.
It was interesting to me that Shenyang, the performance group, was associated with Falun Gong, which was also associated with the Epoch Times. So the Epoch Times had a very distinct link to a performance group. And I thought it was funny that this argument that there's a worrying like melding of entertainment and journalism, and just the fact that there's literal entertainment associated with the same people who fund the Epoch Times.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have the same kind of concern when an MSNBC or a CNN or a Fox will bring someone on as a nominal expert or sort of, political wannabe who's like, I don't know, like a rapper or something like that. Like Ari Melber again will bring on, I think usually on Fridays, he'll bring on like hip hop artists and stuff like that. And to me, it's like, I didn't like it with rock and rollers in the 70s when people would take them seriously and ask them for their political views, especially if they were American, because most of them didn't know anything. But it also makes you look kind of shoddy. It's like, come on, there are plenty of experts you're pandering to us to get us to keep eyeballs on screens by bringing on, Common or something who was on yesterday. And I don't mean that none of these people have anything to say. It's just, I don't have time for that. If I want that, I will go to an arts or culture or music publication and let them speak through that. But they're not experts. Or like actors. A lot of times, there's justifiable concern when like Robert De Niro becomes sort of connected with the left or something. When he became a spokesperson for the left, I don't know. He actually isn't. There's nothing much left wing about him. He's just a Democrat. But that gets annoying. And it does, I think Monica, if this is what you're saying, it can jeopardize the credibility of what might otherwise be a legitimate news gathering organization. If it looks like they're kind of associated with obvious performers, people who kind of make shit up for a living, like actors or, performing groups or whatever that are, again, in the realm of fantasy and entertainment rather than, okay, that's done now, let's talk about what's happening in the world. Yeah. No, I don't think you're overinflating that at all. Because some of these other things have a similar problem. All right, what about QAnon? It's the last one we'll try to do today.
I can go first on this one.
Okay.
So I wanted to start just really quickly for anyone that does not know precisely what QAnon is. Initially, it started with one person identifying themselves anonymously as Q on 4chan, claiming that they were a really high-ranking military official and that they had information from Donald Trump's cabinet about this supposed war on this criminal ring run by people like Hillary Clinton. So what it is in essentials is this person who claimed all these conspiracy theories, claiming that they had access to really high-level information, and posting this on 4chan. And one of the things that I got from the article was that its popularity grew because it was presented almost like a game, because this Q person would drop clues or like these analyses of Donald Trump's speeches or his tweets, or anything that Donald Trump would put out, and supposedly decode them. And then people who were following Q would just wait for these drops of information, like these little breadcrumb trails that were kind of fun to follow. And as time went on, it became easier for people to believe this the deeper that they got entrenched in QAnon itself. And after the initial 4chan community was on there, following all of that, they moved to Reddit, and that's when it gained popularity because it started being covered by YouTube conspiracy theorists, and it became much more accessible to the public through cross-platform means. And that's where it kind of drew more people in, was getting attention from people who wanted followers or subscribers or views by covering the QAnon conspiracy theories, even if they didn't believe in it themselves or stand by it. There was one woman, I forgot to write down her name, but there was one woman who was a YouTuber who said that she only got views because she covered QAnon. Oops, excuse me, in an interview with I think it was CNN. But yes, that's how they exploded in popularity, and people began to get deeper entrenched in the conspiracy theories, even though they can be wild at times. And
Okay, let's stop there. What intrigues me about QAnon, and maybe Kevin might want to speak to this. A lot of what they're espousing, a lot of what they're claiming to be true, sounds so through the looking glass and so absurd. I mean, this isn't Fox News, right? Just saying, oh, Barack Obama isn't a U.S. citizen. Okay, this isn't even as repellent as that was. I mean, you could see I mean, and the idea that every time they had a thing where every time they would refer to him, they would always say Barack Hussein Obama to link him to Saddam Hussein, things like that, because that is his middle name. And there was initially, some uncertainty about, well, where exactly was he born? Birtherism is nonsense, and it was pretty well debunked. But these are in many cases the people who still believe that. So the idea is, and I'm going to ask Kevin, you specifically, where are the facts? Why do people believe this stuff? What's going on? It sounds ridiculous. It sounds like such ludicrous nonsense. It sounds like the National Enquirer. Talk about tabloids. So tell me.
Like where they got the facts?
Well, they didn't get any facts because these aren't facts.
Their opinions, I guess.
Well, in other words, it's not journalism. What is it?
I guess just conspiracy theories.
Well, okay, but what's a conspiracy theory?
Just a baseless theory that
there's a basic conspiracy theory that informs everything that's produced by whatever QAnon is. What is the core conspiracy theory of QAnon?
That the Hollywood elite and various politicians run an inner circle of sorts of criminals.
It's not just an inner circle of sorts. What kind of people are we supposed to be talking about here? I mean, do none of you remember at all that this was the original source for the conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton and a bunch of actors and Democrats were running a secret pedophile ring out of a pizza parlor? I mean, does any of that even sound plausible? I mean, that's not even like Rudy Giuliani stuff. It's hard for me to say it with a straight face, and yet I realize there are a lot of people who absolutely believe this, or at least they behave as though they believe it. Yeah, Renee?
I actually, about specifically that, I have a little piece of my own insight that's not on the article, but through personal experience and people that I know both on social media and in real life, believing the Pizzagate thing, or because they started the hashtag QAnon did from Pizzagate called Save the Children, where they're framing it as you're rescuing kids, you're you're saving them, you're doing something good by following us and by decoding these riddles and these clues that we have. So I think that that may be where some of the appeal lies, is that the people who are following QAnon and decoding these messages truly do feel like they are heroes in this situation. And because it's framed as this good thing to do, as this our duty because our country's falling apart and we have to save these people. I think that might be where more of the appeal lies, and why at least specifically that one is believable.
But who would, first of all, who would have the time to devote the energy to this kind of stuff that these believers do? And where would they get the idea that they were being heroic? Because most of them don't really do much, fortunately, you know. I mean, when they do, it can end up being something like the individual who was arrested at that pizza parlor with firearms, you know, because he'd come to sort the thing out. Okay, that's bad enough. It can also be, and indeed was, one of the many reasons why so many people went to the Capitol on January 6th, and perhaps why, you know, a pretty good, you know, number of people actually breached the Capitol and were ready, at least said they were ready to go and get some people and kill them. Okay. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. That's for other investigations to reveal. But does any of this sound adult to you? It sounds like a weird Pokemon Go from hell to me. Yeah, Brett?
It's so reminiscent of that weird Storm Area 51 thing that happened.
Yeah, nobody remembers that. Yes.
Like, again, I mean, there's a lot of parallels. The whole Roswell and the aliens and all of those conspiracy theories. With a lot of conspiracy theories, like, you have this base thing that whether it may be partially true, it may be not true at all. I mean, MK Ultra was a thing that happened. And
that's true.
So there are conspiracy theorists that end up being right occasionally.
Yeah, sure.
They're a kernel of something that's either true or plausible, and then the conspiracy theorists take advantage of making the other side prove a negative. Like, well, I'm saying it is happening, and now you have to prove that it's not. And it's very difficult to do that when, I mean, that's hard enough to do in real life when when it's true. Prove the negative, and so when there's nothing to be proven, you're now put in this almost indefensible position where, like, you can't prove that something's not happening that you have completely fabricated your own evidence, and now you have created this perpetuating ecosystem almost of people who have nothing better to do than sit. I mean, and again, with COVID, the people are at home, you know, getting paid sometimes lots of money because of what has happened, to just sit at home on their computer. And again, young people who don't necessarily have perspective, and they just created this ecosystem, and they just, everybody fed each other in this weird circuitous way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to refer to that as an ecosystem, and it is a kind of ecosystem, and it's not just conservatives, and it's not people from any one generation or anything else. Dylan, you have your hand up virtually there. What's the question or comment?
The only thing that I was going to add is that I think a really key component of the way that QAnon has spread is that they have sort of these mouthpiece folks that are distilling larger things that would be harder to swallow, like the idea of like a pedophile sex ring being run out of a pizza place. And they're able to take that, pull enough of it to make it sound plausible, to get everyday people to start sharing things about Save the Children that doesn't necessarily say Hillary Clinton Pizza Hut sex ring. There are pieces of it that get distilled further and further down to the point where sort of everyday people may not even be aware that they're spreading things that are rooted in QAnon. And I think that reinforces folks that are more entrenched in it. And I think that it's really a lot, and I don't know if I don't know if this is a superfluous like connection, but I feel like this is somewhat tied to the alienation that a lot of people feel from the mainstream media right now, because you're not really seeing QAnon be touted on even Fox News as like, we're listening to Q. People are going through alternative sources to find information. So if that's going to be a 24-hour YouTube stream, there are people that are going to respect that more than they are even something like the Associated Press, something that is just fact-finding reporting. I think there's a subgenre of people on both the right and the left that don't trust objective fact-finding anymore and are more interested in their own research, whether that's about like vaccines and autism or about the COVID vaccine like being fake and all this stuff about like chipping people. I think we have subsections on both sides that don't trust anything the media says. And so if something is coming out of a non-standard media site that already feels like it could be something that you could consume easily, almost kind of like a tabloidization of what QAnon really is, like the base things that Q is supposedly posting, I think that is part of what makes it so easy to disseminate with people not even realizing where it's coming from originally.
It can be. Here's the thing, though. One of the biggest question about conspiracy theories is why does it seem that so many people seem to be so anxious to believe these conspiracies involving hidden cabals of power? That's usually what it is in America, that there's some sinister secret organization of lizard people who are really running things, right? Why would anybody want to believe that? Because somehow this has to be that people want to believe this. I mean, there's no objective support for any of this. And if you take away the desire to believe, all of it kind of falls apart. Yeah, Renee?
This may not be the right answer to this, but at least what I think about it and what I thought when I was reading the article is, man, these people want to be important so bad. Because especially the person originally claiming to be Q, claiming to be a high-level military officer with access to this insane level of classified information that they're revealing on the internet for all the world to see, and then all those followers wanting to be a part of something special, or like some kind of special secret operatives team wanting to be like you see in entertainment or in television shows or movies. And wanting to be those kinds of heroes that are important when they're doing nothing more than just sitting at home on their computers.
Yeah, it does seem that there's an entertainment component to this, that, when we were talking earlier about the kind of softening of journalism, and a lot of that does involve, and if you read the article, there are even production elements of television news now that are much more entertainment oriented. There are a lot more graphics and enhanced sound. There were criticisms of some of the initial press coverage of the invasion of Iraq that in fact people were photoshopping things. And they were, because that would give the image more impact. But the problem with that is those of us who grew up with nominally objective journalism, even when they got it wrong, it was the idea that, well, that photograph, you can't call that out. Yeah, you can. It isn't so much now what's true, it's what's interesting and what's exciting. And there's that sense of, my life is shit. Nobody cares about me. The government doesn't care about me. Corporations have left our towns. They don't support us anymore. I'm stuck here in this place with COVID or whatever it is. I got nothing going on. And all of a sudden, there's this, this highly placed, powerful individual who somehow, never mind how, because some people just have mystical superpowers, knows all this stuff that's coming down from these, cannibalistic pedophile Hollywood types and all this, because we all know, it's like the culture wars through the looking glass, or culture wars from hell. And it's like, yeah, I'm down. It sounds like something from a video game, and if that's the ecosystem, as Brett said, that you came a political age in, it seems like it's almost like you have to be deprogrammed from that to be able to understand, there's a body of understanding out there that is testable empirically, and this ain't it. And if you don't think that way, one of the things we know is that as far as we can estimate from, anecdotal evidence, and that means we don't know very much, but it seems that a lot of these conspiracies tend to appeal most to the least well-educated Americans, okay, because it fills those gaps in their understanding of the world. I mean, one thing about a college education, whatever else you don't get out of this in terms of a 6-figure income or whatever, if you apply yourself to this, you're going to be able to make sense of the world in a way that a lot of your friends and family and colleagues at work and stuff might not be able to, who don't have the advantage of that education. It doesn't mean they're not smart, but it means you're used to thinking of things in a disciplined and systematic way and testing your assumptions and things like that. That's exactly antithetical to what a conspiracy theory needs. Again, as Brett said, in this kind of ecosystem, there's a certain environment within which these things can propagate and be maintained. Yeah, Renee?
Once we got to the end of the article, like the reading, I was gonna say, because of what you said, kind of believing this stuff at face value, even though there's no real evidence that any of it is real at all. How long it took for people to question who Q even was, that it took so long until these streams started of this other person, the 24-hour streams, and more kind of turning it more mainstream, that it took that long for the people that are entrenched in this to even question who Q is in the first place. Like, who are you? Is this really you? It shocked me, but at the same time didn't. Just because of the rest of the article and talking about how people believed it and how it was presented. But I just thought that was interesting given what you said.
Okay. Yeah, Brett?
I mean, people are still every day falling to Nigerian scammers saying I get calls like 3 times a week. This is police from the Federal Reserve. Police from the Federal, that's not a thing. But people buy it. So, I mean, it's not that strange to think that there's people out there who are just going to buy what whoever Q is selling online. But I think and with this kind of conspiracy, there's just enough Weinsteins, there's just enough Epsteins out there to make it vaguely plausible. Not that there's any evidence that connects really those two guys who were predators in their own right. And then I think this predisposition of Americans to believe in these evil cabals, I think it's honestly part of our national identity at this point. Because if you look at the way back, kind of topic, if you look at the American Revolution, a lot of people who were born and raised in the colonies, England was just something kind of over there, and they were in charge, and then all of a sudden we're fighting a war over it against these people that we, there's some interaction with them, with the soldiers over here, but the king, very few people who lived in America during the Revolution would have had knowledge or interplay with really the real royal authority in England.
You're right.
So this vague concept of someone pulling the strings from somewhere that doesn't really feel or seem real to us, I think that's just something that's kind of maybe I'm completely off base, but it seems like it's just kind of carried through, and there's been some group of people at every generation who kind of revived that feeling that has been here since 1775.
Well, what I'm trying to get at with this too is that when the people who seem to support these things are dismissed, especially by media elites, let's say, as being crazy, or these people are crazy. First of all, as I say, I think that's really bad journalism, but also I don't think it's the point. I mean, you don't have to be mentally ill to be ignorant. I mean, if there are big gaps in your knowledge, and someone, like you said, like Brett was saying, big gaps about who the hell is this King George guy? Yeah, I've seen the drawings of him and things like that. Or for the first few generations of American politics, what's this American president thing you're talking about? I mean, there were studies done as recently as the 1950s and 1960s, and they compared views of the president, who generally are going to be positive at this period of time, and this was with children, right? And they looked at children who lived in places like Appalachia, or the really neglected parts of the country. Their views of the president were overwhelmingly more negative than the national average. I mean, overwhelming, right? Okay, it's because there's this gap of perception there. There's no input, there's no throughput. There might not even, in many of these places have been power, so there's no television. There might not even be radio or very little of that. You're dealing with absolutely grinding, 19th century poverty in mid 20th century America. And you're being told by the local minister or the local newspaper editor or the local whoever, or your mom and dad or whoever, well, these people here who are in charge, they don't care about us. And you know what? They didn't. Okay. So that's not being crazy. There's nothing crazy about that. It doesn't mean it's a good idea. But I think one of the problems with the mainstream coverage of QAnon, Fox News has acknowledged it as, well, it's something to think about, which is giving it a lot more than it deserves. But even Fox News has not looked into the idea of, let's really look at who these people are. These are desperate people. You'd have to be desperate to cling to something like this. There were people who believed, and believed very strongly, that Donald Trump had some secret plan that was going to prevent Joe Biden from being inaugurated. Okay? It's nonsense. They believed that, Mike Flynn in the military, never mind that he's totally disgraced within military circles, that Mike Flynn and the military were going to come in by force and reinstall Donald Trump as president. Okay? They believed this. Well, part of the reason why they accepted it as true, whether or not they actually believed it, was because they were angry. And they felt with some justification that not only were they being ignored economically by the private sector, but in terms of the things they believed in and the way life should be lived and what marriage should be or whatever, all this culture nonsense and all that stuff, that was important to them. And that was something that, Prager it puts out a lot of these things you'll get on YouTube. And one of them recently was, well, there's this thing called, they call it identity socialism. It's gibberish. It means nothing. It's another conspiracy theory. The thing about Prager is they have legitimate connections to things. They themselves have a plausibility to them that makes it sound real. But, even that is more defensible than what QAnon's doing. Because, yeah, some people are going to say, I'm tired of being told that I have to acknowledge a certain kind of identity, or I don't want to hear anymore that, we have to have, these special facilities or whatever, equal rights or special rights, kind of that argument. Even if you don't agree with it, you have to try to make an effort to understand why so many people so passionately do agree with it. And it doesn't mean that they're your enemy, and it doesn't mean that they're insane, and it doesn't mean that they're evil. Okay. And so when we get something like QAnon, because we're so influenced by media, if the media we trust, to the extent that we do, refer to QAnon and everyone around it as crazy, we're more likely to accept that. But if all we get is stuff like QAnon, all of a sudden it's not going to sound so crazy that, well, maybe when they mean, a pedophile ring, or maybe when they mean, this secret, they're using a kind of coded speech because it's a conspiracy, and they, they're telling us in a certain kind of language that, that these things are happening, I mean, there are a lot of people who just aren't very bright too. I mean, there, some of whom are believing Q, but less than intelligence. I think it's more about people who have these huge gaps in their understanding of the world that they live in. And that frightens them. We're most afraid of the things we don't understand. And if you have a lot of gaps in your understanding of the world, you're going to be bombarded daily by things you don't understand. You will not understand Black Lives Matter. You will not understand, transphobia. You will not understand LGBTQ awareness of things and being allies. And you won't understand any of that stuff because no one's taught it to you, and no one's explained it to you, and no one cares enough about you to try to do that. In the meantime, when you go to church on Sunday, or when you go to the hardware store on Saturday, or whatever, everything you hear is mobilized against that. That doesn't make you crazy. And if we keep, and this is the media trope right now. And it's almost like, the people who work for, say, MSNBC or CNN or whatever are kind of saying the very thing they accuse the right of saying. If you don't agree with us, you are crazy. They're not quite saying that, but it's the coverage of these kinds of media and these kinds of phenomena, these conspiracy theories and things like this, has really, really been pathetically bad. Okay. I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not, I mean, QAnon is repellent to me. Okay. That's my personal view. There. Now I've said it. Okay. A lot of things are repellent to me. A lot of things are boring and stupid to me. But I'm not ready to just say, well, if you like those things, you're wrong and you're crazy. Now, you can be wrong in the sense that you can believe things that aren't true. That doesn't make you crazy. Okay. And, you know, I mean, whether you like it or not, the United States Congress changed its order of business significantly today because it took this stuff seriously. Now, we could argue that's the last thing they should have done because that gives a QAnon more power, more influence. It makes it look like, look, we made them change what they do. Apparently, one of the objectives is let's make them declare martial law. Let's make them into the tyrants we believe they are. Okay. But if someone says, for example, the American government is becoming a tyranny, that's not a crazy thing to say. It's not. There are a lot of things about the central government that could be viewed by people, particularly with a libertarian orientation, as being tyrannical. You know, there are a lot of things in public education that could be viewed as tyrannical. Wait a minute, I want to bring my kids up this way. No, you can't. You can't do that. Okay. So in other words, you could be, you could be wrong or you could be misinformed, but it doesn't make you crazy. But when people take these extreme views, and they are no question they are extreme views, but there are extreme views on the left as well, two of them. When you take those and you demonize them, okay, then what you've done is you've censored people. You've taken them out of the media discourse. You've taken them out of the news cycle. And the only time you're going to include them is to make fun of them or to ridicule them or to demonize them. Okay? You know what? That's what we used to do with people of color. And we did it routinely. It's what we used to do with people who weren't sexually binary. And we did it routinely. We demonized them. We diminished them. We made them into things instead of people. And the media were complicit in that. We've got a lot of people in this country, and they're not all conservative, and they're not all old fossils, who are furious about the massive maldistribution of wealth or about the failures of existing institutions or crumbling infrastructure or any number of other things that a country as rich and powerful as the United States should never encounter. There's nothing crazy about that. Okay. But instead we focus on Antifa, all 5 of them, right? Or we focus on QAnon. And everything else that might explain those things gets left out of the narrative. That's a crisis. That's a legitimate crisis in the discourse of America talking about itself. And this is the same thing that happened in the 50s and the 60s. We would invoke anti-communism and close down a whole range of discussion about things. And we would, if you were left-wing or if you were gay or if you were anything out of the normal, you know what? We could beat the living shit out of you and no one's going to care. No one's going to care. Oh, you're a Black Panther? We'll just shoot you. And we'll infiltrate your organization illegally to encourage you to shoot everybody else in the organization. That's exactly what COINTELPRO was. That wasn't a fake conspiracy. That happened. That was, as Brett said of MK Ultra, that was a thing that happened. But America didn't know about it till 1975, 76. And most of America still doesn't know about it because most of America doesn't go to college. And this stuff isn't taught in high school. Okay. And you know where else you don't hear it? The media. For all that they claim to be the first rough draft of history. So I really want you to give this stuff some thought. And it's easy for us to just say, well, Epic Times are a bunch of lunatics, or QAnon, it's a bunch of nonsense. And yeah, there's a bunch of nonsense. And maybe there are, people who aren't quite balanced who are pushing this stuff. But that doesn't explain the appeal of it or the persistence of it for otherwise pretty straightforward people, like your neighbors, depending on where you live. All right. Any questions, comments? Anything else on QAnon? All right. Then we have essentially one more class. Isn't that weird? Yeah, we do. We have one more class, then we are done. Okay, so we'll meet again next Thursday. We'll talk about Facebook. We'll talk about social media as public journalism, and we'll talk about online petitions. And we'll just have a grand time doing it. All right? And then just think of it this way. You'll never have to deal with me again. How about that? Come on, man. That'll get you through the weekend. No more Hughes. All right. All right, then I will see you next Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.